Greetings, Wafube. This is Misal Bay, aka Warlock Asylum, coming at you with the Necronomicon Lessons Part 1. Our subject today will be what is the Chaldean Covenant spoken about in the Simon Necronomicon? I think this is a very appropriate subject because a lot of times when people get involved within the alchemical aspects, this book of alchemy called the Necronomicon, sometimes people have preconceived notions and they're looking for something. If they're looking for something, they're not going to be able to see the text honestly for what it is. And that's how people can get distracted and they can get certain things out of it, but I should state clearly that the Necronomicon is not Ifa, it's not Santeria, it's not Voodoo, it's not Dilemma. But through all systems of extra phenomena or psychosomatic sciences or alchemy, there are certain underlying principles that are similar to the principles of mechanics versus someone who's electronic technician. There are similar principles. However, when it comes down to performing their job, to really getting down to the work, it is different. It's a different assignment. It's a different task. And so for a person to understand the gnosis that's in the Necronomicon by Simon, which is really a framework of how to work with Sumerian mysticism, they would have to approach the system to learn it for what it is rather than coming in with ideas of what they see around them or have been demonstrated in other aspects. Now, there is a good thing about this because when you look into systems of alchemy and self-transformation, in some cases, it's even debatable to even say that some quote-unquote magical systems or even systems of self-transformation. Perhaps there are systems where a person locks themselves up into the world of the dead and they think they're running it, and these things is just blackmailing. That's a way to look at it, to the point where they can't do anything without getting the help of something extra, But the Necronomicon is more free than that, because one thing that we do know is that there's a track record of people who've worked with some of the most popular systems and paradigms and spiritual technologies in the world, yet on a transformative level, they're having a lot of issues and sometimes more issues than the ordinary person. Many of them never get a chance to see immortality. So instead of following and trying to get the neck to fit a mold of something, why not look at it for what it is? Because it could have something in it that can be beyond your wildest imaginations, I could say, And so one of the things that are paramount for a person to understand before entering the paradigm and making use of the spiritual technology is the Chaldean Covenant. And I'm going to share my screen because there's years ago, I wrote an article about obtaining immortality through the Necronomicon tradition. And here's something to think about. If a person has been working with this tone and does not understand its technology in terms of immortality, then they still have a lot more work to do. We all have work to do because, we're here to learn lessons that the cosmic universe has given us to kind of upgrade our souls, and our self. So all of us are here to learn lessons. That's not to be discounted. However, to make the actual realization of what we are spiritually, sometimes it takes quite a bit of time and understanding for that to unfold. So I want to go on a couple of points in the Chaldean Covenant so that we can really get abreast and really get an understanding as far as what the Necronomicon technology, what its process of self-transformation is really all about. You know what I'm saying? So I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second. One of the things I got to work on is being tech savvy. Actually, I am very tech savvy in some ways, but it's just using this program, getting to certain things. So this is what I want to share on screen. Let's pull this up. And this is an article I'm going to post in the description. The article is written back, actually, as you can see, 9 years ago. And its title is Obtaining Immortality Through the Necronomicon Tradition. And as we scroll down, you can see I want to kind of get into a certain section over here. Okay. Let me go up a little bit. I think I went too far down just to discuss some things that we can see clearly written in Necronomicon and discuss them. Okay, about this thing. Okay. I'm going to post the article in the description, but I'm going to take it from the middle and explain there, and we'll just flow with it. Okay, it says, this is a very interesting question, and one that is discussed in a recent article entitled Mysteries of the Gate of Azir. Before we go any further, the Mad Arab tells us that with a careful working of these rites, we can gradually become free of the astronomical influences that lead to death. Now, the next passage will kind of confirm that. Notice what is mentioned in his first testimony and the Book of Calling. My fate is no longer written in the stars, for I have broken the Chaldean Covenant by seeking power over the Zoni. I have set foot on the moon, and the moon no longer has power over me. The lines of my life have been obliterated by the wanderings in the waste over the letters writ in the heavens by the gods. Now, there's a lesson in that, and there's also a teaching in that we'll talk about very shortly. Later on in the Book of Calling, we read, only charge them with the words of the covenant, and they will do as you ask of thou. Be strong. If thou performest these operations often, thou shalt see things becoming dark, and the wanderers in their spheres shall no more be seen by thee, and the stars in their places will lose their light, and the moon, Nana, by whom thou also workest, shall become black and extinguished. Now, I would say, having a little bit more insight into these passages, that what he was talking about was what the covenant leads to as far as our spiritual progression. When you look at astrology, the Chaldeans kind of thought that, in order for us to create, for our light to really shine, we have to be in a space that we understand the stars' influences, because the stars can sometimes have ill aspects, and a person, they should know they have to spiritually cleanse themselves when they're dealing with certain planetary alignments that have ill aspects, just like you're dealing with ill aspects of weather. In the ordinary world, you have to prepare for yourself. You may have to take an umbrella. You have to cleanse and things of that nature. And sometimes the weather can damage the home. Sometimes it can cause a tragedy in life, and it's not something that you call. These are things that can happen in just the movement of the planets themselves in relation to your inner universe. So what he was saying was that if you keep doing these rites, your inner universe will become the greatest influence in your world, right? So that's why the light will become black and extinguished. However, this still doesn't tell us what the Chaldean Covenant is. And as we proceed further, we're going to get a clear understanding of what the Chaldean Covenant is. Okay. Now, as we go on further, let's go to the next paragraph, and I think that's probably all that I pulled from this article. Okay, it says in both these passages, the mad Arab indicates that the rites of the Necronomicon tradition will eventually lead the initiate to a place where they are no longer under the influence of planetary bodies. Although it seems like breaking the Chaldean covenant was not a good thing, as written in the passage cited above, we find that the course of action taken by the mad Arab was in line with ancient Chaldean thought. The science of the Chaldeans worked on the premise of moving beyond the planet's influence. Why should our fate be unpleasant due to a planet's retrograde or what have you? History agrees with this also. Notice what is mentioned in the article Mysteries of the Azir Gate. And actually, there's a link in there. But sometimes when you're dealing with certain websites and templates, because before they used a different template and the link was highlighted. So I think this is referring back to another article that we'll discuss in our next discussion. Okay. But I just want to get this straight. In the article Mystery of the Isaiah Gate, it gets into a quote from Sir Norman Lockyer that was written in 1889. Okay, and it says in the article, it's quoting what this guy is quoting. It's saying the idea of stars as being evil, or as the Mad Arab would say, the most ancient evil, started at a very early date. In 1889, Sir Norman Lockyer mentioned the following about the ancient Babylonians in Nature, Volume 40, page 360. And the planets were regarded as evil spirits, which disturbed the harmony of nature. While the Semitic religion emerged from tribal monotheism, the Akkadians followed a sect professing Mandeism, that is, a religion admitting two principles, one good and one bad. But they thought that as the good gods would not hurt them, it was wise to propitiate the bad ones, and propitiation easily led to worship. That is how the seven planets became their chief deities. Okay, now if you're following this, there's another passage in um, the Necronomicon that talks about this guy named Abdul bin Martu. And this is what they're talking about when he says that, he used to worship the ancient ones and such became blasphemy. But what the Mad Arab was really talking about has a lot to do with what the passages that we were reading. So based on that, um, these Chaldeans were trying to get beyond the the influence of the planets. You know what I'm saying? They were trying to get to a space where they can determine that. And so that's why they were deep into astrology and astronomy, and also measuring the distances. That was just part of their daily life. You know what I'm saying? So the Necronomicon presents an alchemical formula that perpetrates these same principles that ancient Chaldeans had. Okay. And this formula or the idea of it plays out in ordinary religion. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But first, let's discuss the meaning of the covenant and what it says clearly in reflection to what we're reading. So I'm going to pull up another page right here, which you're probably a little bit more familiar with because this is Necronomicon Online. It's one of the sites I use for online reading. Sometimes I'm doing research and I don't feel like, typing a whole paragraph. I just come into an online copy and just copy and paste. That's something for people who are writing, which, about the text that they may want to do. In any case, um, let's get into the covenant and what this actually means. And it says, for this reason, you have ever opened the gate of Adar and spoken to the horned one who resideth there, and giveth all manner of wisdom regarding the operations of necromancy and the spells that hasten unto death. Okay, so let's take that point right there. All right. he's saying that few people have gotten to the gate of Adar because of the sacredness of life and death. You know what I'm saying? Definitely, there's technologies that can really change uh, the outcome of people's lives in the same way a planet can. Now, if you're coming through the ladder of lights and, you know, these energies can affect your reality and you assimilate with them, right? In the process of that assimilation, now your light can affect other people's reality. And so that's why it's a very sacred path. And a lot of times people don't make it to a door, even if they walk the gate. See, this is the thing. What I've learned, when you come into this science and you come with no expectations, right? You're learning about it. It's sort of like, I'm going to digress for a second, like the plant world. You have people, maybe some of y'all may know about it or not, but there's a wonderful book called The Secret Life of Plants. Stevie Wonder, singer, made a song, The Secret Life of Plants, because of the profound information that was brought forth by the guy who made one of the first lie detector tests, where he discovered plant intelligence. Plants are very intelligent, and sometimes I've written about it on the other page, or in Zulu, not so much on this page, but plants are extremely intelligent. You know what I'm saying? They can send signals to each other, they can communicate, all these things. Now, what happens is, a perfect example of this is George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver, he was a guy who was called by Henry Ford the smartest man on the planet. And Henry Ford, he wasn't an easy guy to impress. People forget that Henry Ford, unfortunately, he had some anti-Semitic, statements. You go to a paper called the International Jew, and that wasn't cool. He was promoting his anti-Semitic ideas. However, he thought that someone, African American scientist, George Washington Carver, was the most smartest man on earth. And George Washington Carver, he had made numerous inventions. He did a lot of things with peanut oil. I mean, this dude was completely um, enlightened as a human being. However, how he got to his technology, if you read about his life story, he used to walk in the woods and the plants would communicate with him. And they told him, like, look, if you keep treating us like sentient beings, because he would touch the plants, he would talk to them, just like he would talk to people, he said, we'll give you more information. And this is how these worlds are, right? In the unseen world, it operates the same way. And why I'm saying this is because a lot of scientists, when they start learning all these great things that other scientists were learning about plants, they came in with a real scholastic attitude and hard edge, and the plant world just wouldn't open up to them. So they were like, "Oh, these dudes are talking about hoax." It wasn't a hoax. It's just that world doesn't open up to you until you have a certain type of inner glow. It says this throughout the whole book. So people could pick up the Necronomicon and they could perform hoodoo and stuff, right? But there's a trick to all of this. Not a trick, but more like a trap. And it mentions, as we read the verse over again, it says, for this reason, few have ever opened the gate of Adar and spoken to the Horned One who resideth there and giveth all manner of wisdom regarding the operations of necromancy and of the spells that hasten unto deaths. Few have lived that. How is that possible when so many people have walked the gate of Adar? Well, what normally happens is that usually when I first started walking, we had a saying that if a person doesn't make it past Ishtar, then the system isn't for them. But a person can go on in the system even further, and they can do all the rites, they can complete all the tasks, and they would never have really complete the gate walking, because what happens is, if the energy is impure, if it's not in line with the purpose of the tome itself, it will send a person down a path of delusion. And it talks about this in the Simon Necronomicon. We'll discuss later, but basically, to give you a roundabout way, I don't remember the passage word for word, but it just says that for those who can't understand the words of this book, it that in itself shows that the demons have power over them. So they'll go on these tangents, and you'll see it sometimes in online videos talking about stuff that really don't make any sense, just even on the basic levels of alchemy or just the science of the unseen world. And they'll be elated. This is what this means because this is this and this is this. And it has nothing to do with that. But that's their path given to them by the forces in the tone because they want to make it something that it's not. You see what I'm saying? And this is how this happens. Now, when we go on further, it says, only when thou hast shown power over the masculine and the Rabishu. You see that? Only then. Anyone could do the rituals, but only when one has shown power over the masculine and the Rabishu. There's certain inner tests. And if one is not prepared for it, you know, they can go on and rock the aesthetics of what the Necronomicon represents to the phenomenal world, to people who are blind to the beauty of the light that it possesses. They'll go on like, yeah, man, you know, this is all about this and stuff. I mean, I even fell into that for a little bit. You know what I'm saying? You wake up, you get out of it. But you have to deal with your own inner reckoning. You know what I'm saying? For those worlds to open up to you. And you also have to deal with disillusion. And that's what happens. A lot of people who pursue the cult, I'm not saying everybody, of course, there's a lot of beautiful people. But there's a lot of people, however, who may have had certain type of backgrounds coming up. Maybe they were the child that was picked on. Maybe they were, you know, bullied, and now they want to get this power to get back at society or to feel a certain inner confidence because they have this. When they get into the Necronomicon, they're done. They're done. They will never get it because, you know, when you talk to people, the Necronomicon is actually a unifying force. There's a rumor that, you know, it's separate and distinct, and people who are involved in it, they're usually soloists. No, those are evil spirits trying to isolate you from society. It's nothing to do with what the purpose of the book is. And it may seem that way, but you can call a person out on that very instantly by just asking them, telling them a simple truth and watching them refute it because it 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 doesn't align with their understanding that they have no backing for. So once that happens, and you see that, oh, this person's still dealing with the masculine and the Rabishu, so they don't understand it. And you can never really, like, you can shed that light if you have that light in you the same way the planets do. But if they're dealing with their own masculine and Rabishu, you can talk your head into the ground. They're not going to understand. They're going to still go back and do this stupid stuff and then deal with the consequences in their personal life and think like, oh man, you know, if I just put a little bit more oil on the candle, it might have been different. So, and that's not to get, you know, an attitude with it. It's a very beautiful process ultimately. Sometimes, however, I've dealt with people who are just stubborn, and it's a lesson for me because, you know, when you in certain realms, at first I used to think it was different because of the position. Like if you're on the moon, your view of the sun is different than if you're on Mars. You see what I'm saying? But now I realize that no, it's when you're seeing the whole world as it is because of the inner light you're manifesting. You know what I'm saying? Those things come out of the way. But because people, they're more interested in technique, they become like spiritual crackheads, but they're just interested in a different high. So now, when you recognize what the Chaldean Covenant is, then you become aware of that. Then you can see those people clearly and deal with them accordingly. You see what I'm saying? Because, you know, that's not really cool. And so let's go back over this again with Now, with this understanding that we have, for this reason, few have ever opened the gate of a door and spoken to the horned one. That's something to deal with. Who's the horned one? Okay. Who resides there and giveth all manner of wisdom regarding the operation of diplomacy and the spells that hasten unto death. Only when thou hast shown thy power over the masculine and the issue, may thou venture forth in the lands of the Agigi. And for this reason was the covenant made. Okay, that's clearly the reason why the Chaldean covenant was made. Okay. You know what? Other covenant is just like that. The Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic law. All those things reflect the same thing. But even in those cases, a lot of people who live by those codes are also affected by the masculine and the Ribishu because, as we shall see, they take it literally. Okay. I've worked with the lands of the Agigi, right? I'm gonna tell y'all some real stuff. Since we in the chamber now and we getting the tradition popping, whatever, getting it accoladed. I'll show you how things work and what you can say and what you can't say to people who are under the influence of the masculine and the Ribishu. But if you think about it, the land of the Agigi, that's the true promised land. Why? Because you're not in the planetary realm, right? When I went into the Agigi, there were several of us that went in at the same time. I had came up, I understood how, what the ceremony was for entering it and how to walk through it. So there was about 5 or 6 people who were walking through the Agigi at the same time. And man, it was crazy because it was so, like, in comparison to the gates was like living in a thunderstorm because the planets are constantly moving and deliberating fates. So if you constantly walking, that's all you're gonna get. You know what I'm saying? Is you're gonna get to know the fates better. Maybe there's some things that you need to work on, but you don't work on them through gate walking. You work on them through the calling. You know what I'm saying? And that's another trap that we'll talk about in a future episode. However, and it's something that I had learned later, but when all of us was walking through the Agigi, it felt Christ-like. That's all the imagery that kept coming up because you walk with the Agigi with the sun. When the sun goes into its constellation, you go with it because the sun is a protector. And in the Mad Arab, in the Necronomicon, the Mad Arab says this: you shouldn't take any ambitious strivings against the ancient ones in regards to the Igigi. That's what he's talking about. So we knew, like, we got to work with the flow of this. And then as we start working with it, we realize that's where the true covenant is at. That's where the true promised land is at. That's the land of milk and honey because you're no longer under planetary influence. Once you break that cycle of planetary influences, the forces, when you're working with it kind of works in a way that's a back and forth relationship. So it is good that people have to deal with their masculine issues because the plants is pulling that up out of them. And so as they're going through it, they have to deal with these things because they're in the planetary realm and that realm is moving. It's like a shepherd's rod. So it's constantly like back and forth, boom, 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 boom. And you feel it internally. You may feel depressed one day, you may feel happy in a neighborhood that doesn't call for it, or you can feel sorrow in a beautiful place full of flowers, or like in the open field or something. But you can feel the energies. But once you get into the Gigi, it's land of peace. You know what I'm saying? And there's different reasons for it that I know now that I didn't know years ago. You know what I'm saying? So it's really like a blessing, to be able to go through that process. But that's the promised land. It's not Israel in the Middle East because that's only going to cause war and bloodshed. And this is what I mean by, like, even like in the Abrahamic covenants, or if you want to really get, really kind of get jazzy with it, you look at the 144,000 mentioned in Revelation ruling with Christ. Why are they ruling with Christ? Because when you in the Gigi, what happens is that you can use the sun as a projector to project your consciousness out in the world in a very metaphoric sense. So instead of being the recipient of the retrogrades and everything, you you have your best times during the retrogrades. That science is also experienced in Nzubu. Why is the science of the Igigi with the retrogrades experienced in Nzubu? Because when I first went through the Igigi, I stopped at the last step, right, which is Pisces. When you read the Abbey Tablets of the Crow, it's a Piscean book. The whole book is about my travels in the constellation of Pisces. The whole science of it is. So that's why when people say certain things, they don't know what they're talking about on that level, because when you're in the constellation, you can't stay there. Each constellation, you can stay there for a minute. And there's a lot of things that you'll learn because it's different than people who are living under the influence of planets. So, of course, people who are under the planetary influence, they're not going to understand anything that you're talking about because they're still dealing with the masculine and the Ribishu. But when you're walking through the Agigi, that is the promised land. And so, because of the sacredness of it, because of the crowning of it, it's it's why the covenant was made, so that it doesn't allow the impure to it could never happen anyway, because water always seeks its own level. You can never be impure and reach certain heights of spiritual cultivation. And Simon talks about this in the beginning of the Necronomicon. I'm going to pull that up shortly, but I want to kind of like um, definitely deal with what the meaning and the depth of all of this is, because when you really get into the depth of this information, is really beautiful. So let's read that passage again, and then I'm going to come back around. It says, only when thou hast shown thy power over the masculine and Rabishu, may thou venture forth in the land of the Agigi. Now, if you're honorable, you know what I'm saying, you may have some things to work on. Maybe you may say, hey, you know what? I know what the Chaldean Covenant is about. I don't even want to deal with that now until I get through certain things. Let me use the system honestly as a spiritual technology of spiritual cultivation, because I do believe that there is salvation and virtue. Right? Other people, out of curiosity or, the sugar pill, they're going to try to force their way in. And what usually happens is that they get diminished to the land of the dead. And I had, had experienced this. So when you start like, promoting the land of the dead, because land of the dead is closer to this reality in a certain sense, because you have spirit realm, which is adjacent to that land. And those things are lower to the phenomenal world. So they take off right away. So right away people think, oh man, this is powerful because, I did something and something happened. But all it just means that you're dealing with something that's very close to this world. There's a difference between the spirit world and the divine world. See what I'm saying? So when you dealing with what you got to deal with, you got to keep these things in mind. Some people, they may not even be interested in that, because they just think, hey, if I do this, I'm gonna get this done, or da da whatever, and that's wrong thinking. And it says, and for that reason, the covenant was made. So the covenant was made for those seeking to enter the promised land, the land of the Agigi, that you can enter into this lifetime. Now, how do we show and prove that the land of the Agigi is the promised land for the practitioner of the Simon tone? Where can we see that in Summa? All right. You can see it in Summa by looking into the book of Revelation. And this is also on the blog page, the 144,000. Where does 144,000 come from? Okay. I'm not going to show it here, but anyone who has a copy of the Simon Necronomicon, everyone knows that the land of the Agigi is a sign for Dingir Inki. It's very simple, right? Very simple. Dingir Inki, his number is 40, right? Okay, that's interesting. Now, during the time of the Sumerian kings, right? During the time of Sumerian kings, archaeologists have been baffled, completely baffled. Why? Because when you look at the Sumerian kings list, they count 1 year as 3,600 years. I'm like, man, why they do that? You know what I'm saying? Why would they count 1 year as 3,600 years? Well, let's look at this formula. And once we see this, we can clearly understand that the land of the Agigi is the promised land, okay, based on Sumerian technology. Anu, the crown of Anu, the crown that one wears when they complete reaching the door. We see it in the ceremonies of calling. We see one is adorned with the crown of Anu, right? And it's like, man, that's kind of interesting. You know what I'm saying? And that's when they're supposed to do the calling. They're not supposed to. This is another thing. I'm gonna insert it here, but we'll have a video on it soon. Like, you're not supposed to do the calling until you got through the planetary round. You know what I'm saying? Someone's like, oh man, I reached a, now I'm gonna make a ceremony now. No, you can't even do that right at that point. You got to get through the seven first. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So it's like you got to get through the lessons before you call yourself God. So you got to get through the seven before you can wear the crown of Anu. The crown of Anu's number is 60, right? Ancient Chaldeans, they looked at the zodiac as a clock that has 60 minutes. 60 times 60 is 3,600. That tells us why 1 year to a Sumerian king was counted as 3,600 years, because that's how much wisdom he had when he went around the zodiac. You see what I'm saying? So every year to a Sumerian king or to the priest who wears the crown of Anu is like 3,600 years of life. You know what I'm saying? The things that you learn. You see what I'm saying? Because we're going to discuss why this is the case in a second. Okay. Now, 60 times 60 minutes of a clock, which the zodiac was the clock. The Chaldeans looked at the zodiac as a clock. That's 3,600. Okay. Now, but the land of the Agigi is the land of Enki. What's 3,600 times 40? 144,000. Those who will rule with Christ, the Christ consciousness, the Christos, Marduk, that he talks about in the beginning of the Simon Necronomicon, how all the deities have went through the underworld to come up. You know what I'm saying? The seven planets is also part of that underworld. You know what I'm saying? So now we know that the land of the Agigi is the promised land. And in that, we also know that a lot of promises that are made to people who prescribe to Abrahamic religion is not a literal interpretation, because all that's going to lead to is bloodshed and war. You see what I'm saying? So this path is very pure. You mean? So now let's go back into this thing, and it says right here, you can see me right here, it says, and for this reason the covenant was weighed, that none shall walk through the sunken valleys of the dead before having ascended to Marduk, nor shall they breach the gates that lie beyond the door until they have seen the sign of the mad god and felt the fury of the hellish queen. So in order to access heaven and hell, one has to complete the journey into, with the seven gates, with the lab. They have to purify themselves. And only the pure can see that world. I remember I was dating this lady at the time, and I was working with Yanzia. And, it started occurring to me that all those superstitions that were said around spiritual workers and people wasn't really superstitions, but you had to be on a certain vibration to feel those energies. You had to be pure inside to experience that. So other people outside in the phenomenal world, their eyes is closed to it. They're not open. For us, be open to it. You know what I'm saying? So I remember I was walking down the street. It was like about 10 o'clock. I was in Brownsville or whatever, and this cat comes by, screeches in front of me. So I knew, like, man, I gotta look up around me, and I see two dudes locking and loading their guns, and they went on about their business or whatever. But you know, these are some of the things that practitioners can see because they're pure. So nature responds to them. They give them a heads up. They may tell them some information because now this person is no longer unclean. They're one of us. And so the idea of the cat screeching or a familiar or plants being able to depart certain wisdom is what was lost when Adam was deemed impure. He can no longer speak to the animals. The animals can no longer speak to them. And those animals could be anywhere from a little animal to a starry constellation that's depicted as an animal. You see what I'm saying? And so all those things that people doubt, those sciences are real sciences for people who are pure in heart. Now, you do have some gangster spirits who have technology also. And what they will do is they would sew some things onto a person's crown so that they can see. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of what they're dealing with is on a certain vibration of negativity and fear. So that becomes like one of the biggest influences in the world. And I'm not going to really say too much about those things or judge it because those are also very primordial sciences. But in any science that you deal with, that's a science of hidden alchemy and spiritualism, you got to be careful of being extorted. And what I mean by that is I've seen it happen to people where they call on something, they call it so much that when they stop calling it, whatever they were calling starts making problems for them so they can call on it again. You have to be very careful of that. You know what I'm saying? So this is truly amazing, and it really reaches into some things. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now so I can get back, and I'm gonna look up something. Okay, so there we go, back on track. So if you saw my eyes on the paperwork, it was because I was looking into something. I'm gonna dip into this thing again. Let me just blow this up right quick. I'm going to dip into a passage that I think will be quite useful, and then I'm going to share the screen again, and it will kind of be great to look at again. Let me just use a word find. Okay, that's the great thing about online economics. You know what I'm saying? So let me see. Let me just go one more, and then I can get this. All right. Okay. This is what I was looking for. This is in the second testimony of the Mad Arab, or the testimony of the Mad Arab part two. I have to start addressing it like that because a lot of times I'm saying the second testimony. It's really the testimony part two. Okay. And I'm going to share my screen again so we can get back into this. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we are right here. We're back. We're going to share our screen again. Get back right into the book. So you see I got some word highlighted because I was using the word find. You can see my cursor moving or whatever. And this is the passage I want to discuss with y'all that confirms what was said earlier in our conversation. It says that this book were an amulet, a seal of protection. That's a whole other story that we'll get into. Maybe we'll get into next week. Let me know in the comment section what y'all would like to discuss, but we have to keep it in a like lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3 type of series. Like it should be kept with some of the people. So right now we're discussing prerequisite stuff. So prerequisite questions like what is the Chaldean Covenant is very important. Questions like who is this deity? That's the stuff you need to do. You know what I'm saying? I don't need to do that research. You need to do it because you have the question. So, but in a discussion format that we're having, you want to keep things that is not to the eyes of the lazy. So saying like it's like it should be something that's flowing with what we're doing. So there may be some things that you see, but I do see that that this book, that this book were an amulet, a seal of protection. I think that's one of the things that we have to discuss. I'll look over some things and we'll get to a discussion about them. Okay, it says that my ink, for the ink of the gods and not of men. That's also another discussion because it's telling you how the book came about, okay, and why it came about. But I must write hastily, and if thou cannot read nor understand this writing, perhaps it is a sign enough for thee of the strength and the powers of the demons that be. So that tells you if the more you understand this writing, the more it's a testimony to how purified you are. You know, and it takes years. Like I've been involved in this relationship with the Necronomicon for about it's been about 20 joints. And then I had studied Sumer like from I would say like around 1993. So I've been involved in this for like over 20 years, you know, well over 20 years. And so you know, it's been an amazing process, but there's still things that I learned. There's times where of recent Um, I had took a long time. I wasn't messing with it, you know, whatever. And actually, that was the best thing because, however, this is another thing. However, if you get entrapped into a certain way of thinking, like this is how the ritual works and this is how this happens, there is a standard method. You know what I'm saying? I'm not really going to discuss rituals. I never discussed them, even when I was blogging every day about the book, because I feel that that's something between the practitioner and the teacher. So people ask me about rituals. I really don't get into them unless I've worked with the person directly. Um, I just don't get into that sort of thing because I think that's sort of outside the preview of what should happen. You know what I'm saying? As far as like learning, we just don't discuss stuff like that openly. So people may ask me, I may answer a question that I would never give a complete answer to that. I'm really straight up. You know what I'm saying? I might discuss a couple of things because there were a couple of things that are huge traps in the Necronomicon. Um, but really, if you're not aware of those traps, you won't know what's going on. I can tell you where they're at, and I may discuss that one day. But I'm not going to get into how the rituals are done because that's another dynamic. Not right now, anyway. So, in any case, we can see that you know the clarity of the work if it's not really understood it 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 shows that demons will have power over a person and they'll keep reiterating the same falsehoods and those falsehoods are a reflection of falsehoods that you're holding on to that need to be broken. You see what I'm saying? So what I was getting at was that before I had certain falsehoods and they were manifested in my practice. You know what I'm saying? There were huge falsehoods about the Necronomicon and how it works. I mean, huge. And some of that stuff just wasn't true. You know what I mean? And they were my falsehoods. You know what I'm saying? And in order for you to see that, you have to step away from it. You know what I'm saying? You still be in the family. It's just like if you have a spat with your parents, like, look, man, you know, I'm gonna come by here, I'm gonna check on you, I'm gonna call you every day. But I gotta think about this in the park. You know, it's like that sort of thing. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes you may have to go to your aunt's house, you may have to go to another spiritual house that for you to get certain principles, you know, you might can see it clearly through another way. And then when you see those principles clearly, then you can kind of see what you had to do. And this is what the beauty of the neck is. There was a book that was put out called the Buddhanomicon. You see that in the Necronomicon, it contains a wide range of different forces. but it's still one technology. You know what I'm saying? And even the Mad Arab, in the earlier part of the book, in the Testimony Part 1, he calls the god Naga, which is like a Siberian god of death. It has nothing to do with Sumeria. So the Necronomicon, in some ways, is not all about Sumeria, but it is in a way, because most of what we see in the world of divinity are the energies of Sumeria transformed into something else. But I just say that to say that, like, even the Mad Arab had to go through other things to get an understanding of who he was and how it worked. And by the end of the day, the reason why the Mad Arab disappeared is because he no longer had an ego. That's what that's what the whole second testimony is about. The testimony of the Mad Arab part two. Part 2 and 1, there's a certain way to read it that we'll discuss later on. But if you really looking into the text, you kind of see that, like, yo, man, all that stuff with deities, all that stuff, it vanished because he wasn't looking for anything. But he knew that, wherever he was going, he always used the word I knew. So he had that crown, and he wrote the book on the plains of the Agigi. You know what I'm saying? And through his passage, he was so much at peace that all that stuff that was going on with the fates and planets doing that stuff, he didn't feel that anymore. See what I'm saying? So, that's a beautiful thing. There's another passage. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second. Get back to y'all right quick. All right, and I'm gonna look up another passage. So you're gonna see me looking into the computer for a second because I want to pull something else up that was really insightful. And it's in the introduction. I always, I read this so often that I forget what it is because I've read it so often I like remember it, and I could probably go into it verbatim, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to build that up. I just want to share information. So let me go into, but definitely the text is a beautiful text, and it's unique. It's extremely unique, and at the same time, it's extremely misunderstood. Hold on a second. Let me just see if I can find. Okay, it's not in this section. I'm gonna try one more, and I think this is. Let me see something. I think it was a section before. Let me see something. Yeah, I think it was the section before. Well, it could be here. If not, we'll find it on the next episode. I really don't want to do that, but man, I used to quote this often too. Let me just see what's going on. But definitely, hold on, I think I see it. Okay. This is my favorite passage. This is the only thing that is ill about using online versions is that, like, if you remember a page number and you looking for something, you really can't find it too much. But let me just give you all a little something. Okay. Let me see. No, it's not in there. It's gotta be. Let me see if it's in the mythos. Okay, I think this is in this. Okay, I think this is it right here. Um, okay. I probably have to edit this part out and shoot a video, or maybe not. Just double check or something else. Oh, I think I know where this is at. Okay. Okay. Yes, this is it. Okay, so the covenant is also explained in the introduction of the Simon Necronomicon, and ironically, it's explained in a section titled "The Devil" in the introductory notes. Let me turn the camera back on, so we'll get this back on, popping. And so that is the section that explains that, and I'm going to blow up my screen again so that we can read this together. Let me go into share screen mode. Okay, here we go right here. Let me share the screen again. Okay, there we go. So you can see my mouse moving around. Taking in consideration of what we discussed already and, about the Chaldean Covenant, let's look at these words under that discussion, and that will give us further affirmation as far as what the Chaldean Covenant is and its purpose that's clearly stated by the Mad Adam. This was written, quote unquote, by Simon in the introduction. It says, an alternative possibility exists that by the landing on the moon, we have come to reinstate the ancient covenant and hereby assure the protection against the outside. Okay, so what he's saying is that even for man as a race to get to the technological state that he did, it came with his adherence to certain um, purifying forces. Man couldn't get to um, reach the moon, like not in the sense where he's using technology, he's sacrificing people. He couldn't get there. You know what I'm saying? So even like in his purity, he's been able to achieve a lot of things technologically. Man's become much smarter, and he should, because if you see certain things in the past, why are you going to go back and do that? You see what I'm saying? So through that, he's been able to get to achieve the better part of himself, and that's also the key to a practitioner. If you are following these things the way they're supposed to be followed, and you're checking your ego, because that's really what the demons are in a lot of different ways, and the improper use of the ego, and some of our own inklings, shattering some of our own false ideas about ourselves, you'll get to a better part of yourself. You see what I'm saying? So let's continue on. An alternative possibility exists that by landing on the moon, we have come to reinstate the ancient covenant and thereby assure our protection against the outside. Since the gods are forgetful, by treading on their celestial spheres, we are reminding them of the ancient obligations to us, their created ones. For as it is said in one of man's most ancient of covenants, the emerald table, as above, so below. So that's a covenant. That's something to be explored also. But when you understand the premise of the covenant and one's reach, because even like we're talking about reaching the land of the Igigi, that's like jinn consciousness, because the jinn would listen to the stars. You know what I'm saying? So that's like in a lot of writings I talk about Jinn consciousness, and then from Jinn consciousness you can go from to angelic consciousness by traveling through the Igigi, right? So that's kind of what that implies, and this is further um, proven in the Emerald tablets, because that's the same premise, in those Hermetic laws or whatever. But let's continue on, and it says man's powers to alter the nature of his environment must develop simultaneously with his ability to master his inner environment, his own mind, his psyche, soul, spirit. Perhaps then the lunar landing was the first collective initiation of humanity. So he's really saying the same thing. Like, you have to master your inner self. And over the past 2,000 years, in the Christ era, the era of the Muzi, it has been, um, we've seen things progressively grow to a much more stable reality. And because of that, man's been able to benefit in a much greater capacity than he was in his barbaric stage, you know what I'm saying? And that's what we have to keep in mind, is that man as a race, he's growing to the condition of the elder gods. So in the text, a lot of the stuff that it says is that this book was handed down because this is a form of technology that can help you grow, learn how to protect your planet, you know what I'm saying? And with the Sumerian element, amid all the other intelligences that are in the text, it is definitely potent uh, in allowing one to achieve the greater good. And that's what Necronomicon is written for, and that's why the Chaldean Covenant was established. And when you understand that, nothing else could be clearer. But you have to approach it in honesty and respect. So this will actually conclude our first episode, Necronomicon Lesson Part 1. And we'll be back shortly with Necronomicon Lesson Part 2. And I look forward to communing with you all. And I just want to say have a good night. Be safe out there. There's a lot of stuff going on since the COVID. But, keep your virtue up, and keep striving for the best, to be the best part of yourself, and all things will come into fruition. This is me, Sal Bay, aka Warlock Asylum, saying have a good night.